I'd like to start today's lecture with a brief recap of our previous lecture. The daguerreotype was the first officially announced photographic process offered by the French government to the world in August 19, 1839. The daguerreotype is small, they're highly detailed, they're a mirror image, meaning all of the information is reversed. Daguerreotypes are made on a copper plate which is coated with silver and then highly polished. Once exposed, it's developed with the vapor of mercury. It's fixed, so it's no longer sensitive to light. Then it's sealed and encased with glass to prevent oxidation. Most were pocket-sized. Importantly, daguerreotypes were one of a kind and they were very difficult to reproduce. The other process that was being worked on at that same time by William Henry Fox Talbot in England is the Calotype, also known as saltpaper prints. This is a paper negative positive process, meaning he would make a negative on paper with all of the tones reversed, then would put that in contact with another sensitized piece of paper and shine light through that to create a positive from that negative. Because the paper itself is fibrous, it diffused the detail, so the details in calotypes don't have nearly the amount of information that available in a daguerreotype. But the negative positive process allowed for multiple copies to be made. So I have one daguerreotype in my collection. I got it a number of years ago, found it in an antique shop. I think I paid about $35 for it. Much more difficult to find them today. When you do, sometimes what they sell as daguerreotypes is actually a different later process called an ambrotype. Ambrotype is basically a photograph on glass. They look like daguerreotypes to an untrained eye, but they're quite frankly much more common and less valuable. Just a quick story, I was at an antique shop a few years in Oroville. They had a number of ambrotypes that they were selling for a couple $100 a piece as daguerreotypes. I looked at them and told them, these aren't daguerreotypes, these are ambrotypes. They actually didn't seem at all interested. So indeed, if you're looking to buy a daguerreotype, hopefully you'll see one beforehand. Once you know what they look like, they're pretty easily recognizable. They often come in what are called union cases. I'm going to try to get it in the light so that you can see this well. This is usually made out of some sort of fibrous wood product with a lot of shellac. They're molded and often really quite elaborate. I'll show you front and back. This one has a little clip on the side here to hold it in place. But let me try opening this. Again, the daguerreotype, and this is a sixth plate, which is about 2 3/4 inches by 3 1/4. Daguerreotype is on a highly polished piece of metal. It's a copper plate coated with silver. If you don't get the image just in the light right, it's actually very difficult to see. I'll move it around and you'll see that often it simply looks like a mirror. But indeed, you get it in the light right, you can see that it's a really highly detailed photograph. This is very typical in terms of the imagery. The absolute bulk of daguerreotypes are portraits. But anyway, typical case, typical daguerreotype. Just thought I'd give you some sense of the scale, because when we look at slides of these, depending on the size of your computer, they often look like they're much larger than they actually are. You can see this 6 plate I can easily fit in my hand. The daguerreotype in America. Photographer Ansel Adams wrote, "I confess that I frequently appraised my work by critical comparison with the daguerreotype image. how urgently I desire to achieve that exquisite tonality and miraculous definition of light and substance in my own prints. When the daguerreotype process was announced in 1839, two life philosophies reigned in Western cultures. Romanticism was in its waning years, basically was from about 1780 to 1850 and was centered in Europe. Romantic art favors imagination over reason and emotion over intellect. Romanticism was an intellectual movement, partly a revolt against the aristocratic social and political norms. Romantics railed against the scientific rationalization of nature. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, writer and philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote. Where earlier generations, the Age of Enlightenment, saw human commonalities, creatures endowed with reason, the Romantics saw diversity and uniqueness. Romantics explored the genius of humankind. Humankind became the center of our own universe. The Creator was seen as embodied in each person. Humans were glorified. Thus, the desire with the daguerreotype was not just pictures, but portraits. The philosophy of naturalism was centered in the United States. Naturalism refers to a view that natural laws and forces operate the universe, not necessarily mankind. To naturalists, nature could be domesticated, but nature itself was the key to greater understanding. Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his 1836 piece, Nature, wrote, "Every natural fact is a symbol of some spiritual fact." A culture so preoccupied with the factual aspects of the world could only be enthralled with the unmitigated naturalism available in photography. Americans accepted photographs as true depictions of nature, and indeed they became surrogate realities. Samuel Morse claimed that the first photographs were, quote, painted by nature's self, with a minuteness of detail that cannot be called copies of nature, but portions of nature herself. By the late 1840s, the negative-positive paper calotype process supplanted the popularity of the daguerreotype in Europe. Yet from 1840 through the mid-1850s, the daguerreotype in America reigned supreme. And while views of all sorts of subjects were made, portraits were by far the most common American daguerreotypes. Americans' new traditions in visual imagery had been transported from Europe. These included portraiture, as you see samples of John Singleton Copley and the American-born Benjamin West, or history painting, images that depict historic human events in Europe or America. Enthusiasm for the daguerreotype was high, but initially portraiture was difficult. Exposures were too long for a person to sit comfortably. The picture was inverted, backwards, again, a mirror image. The mirror-like surface was difficult to see. You had to hold it in the right kind of light to be able to see it at all. And perhaps more importantly, as unique, singular, one-of-a-kind images, the daguerreotype was not easily reproducible. So enthusiasm was not universal. Jean-Auguste Ingres, the French neoclassic painter, publicly denounced the daguerreotype, but secretly he used these photographs as material to sketch from. One German critic wrote, quote, "God created man in his own image, and no man-made machine may fix the image of God. Is it possible that God should have abandoned his eternal principles and allowed a Frenchman in Paris to give the world an invention of the devil?" The daguerreotype equipment was costly too, but scaled-down models were soon introduced. In 1840, several advances made portraits much more feasible. A lens with a wider aperture allowed nearly twice the amount of light striking the plate. An aperture in a lens is similar to the iris in your eye. In areas where there's less light, you can open up the aperture to allow more light to come in. Conversely, areas with strong light, you stop that lens down to allow less light through the lens, which also increases the depth of field, the amount of things that are in focus from near to far. Also, a way to increase the plate's sensitivity to light by recoding it with an accelerator. Combined with the faster lenses, this cut exposure times to less than a minute. Lastly, after development and fixing, the plate was gilded or toned by bathing it in gold chloride, which intensified the tones of the image. Once these improvements to the process were made, portrait studios emerged everywhere. The process was now easy to learn and cheap to do. I'm going to play you a short, about 3-minute video of the making of a daguerreotype. Daguerreotype plates sizes were generally standardized. A 1/6 plate was the most common, which was around 2¾ inches by 3¼ inches. In 1850 in America, a 6-plate portrait would cost about $2. A full plate was 6½ by 8½ inches. Daguerreotypes replaced miniature painting, which was the most common source of portraiture until the daguerreotype. Many of these miniature painters went to work tinting daguerreotypes. Indeed, one of the criticisms of early photographic work, particularly with daguerreotypes, was their lack of color. They were black and white. So the colors that you see in this image, for example, were transparent paints that were applied to the surface of the photograph to make it look more realistic. In addition, if you'll notice in this image and in many of the ones that you're going to see today, if the people look stiff, there's a few reasons for that. The exposures were still long, sometimes up to a minute, certainly several seconds in length, even in bright sunlight. Most people can't stand or sit comfortably for that length of time, so head clamps were used, a metal head clamp that would clamp your neck and hold you in place. Sometimes little kids, like you see here, might have a stick or a pole coming up behind them, and underneath their clothes, they're tied to the stick. So if they look uncomfortable, they often are. You see that here as well. Interestingly, the expressions on the faces back then. I always just assumed that seeing how unhappy most of the kids looked was due to the fact that they were clamped in place. And that indeed may be an important aspect of that. In this image, you can see that clamp, at least the bottom of it, that would come up here. And again, she'd be tied to the clamp under her clothes. So that leads to the dour looks on some of their faces, but something that I've learned recently. In the 19th century, there was really no history of people posing for photographs. So now we're all pretty much trained to smile for the camera. That wasn't the case then. Indeed, it was commonly believed that if you smiled for the camera, you were a lunatic. So most people looked quite serious, not wanting to come off as crazy. These are mostly anonymous examples. The frame that you see it in, they were often included in elaborate frames or what were called union cases, and you'll see a few examples today, very elaborate and decorative. One of the styles of portraiture that emerged was called occupationals, essentially showing people at work the things that they do to make a living or what their interests are. And this man you can see posing with his collection. Daguerreotypes are mirror-like surfaces. They're hard to photograph. So a lot of the marks that you see, the sort of dust and scratches, are indeed sometimes that. Sometimes it's oxidation over the years where air has reacted with the silver. So sometimes you're even going to see some coloration in these slides that aren't necessarily true to the original. Again, in this example, you can see the work of a tinter retouching the photograph with paints to make it look more realistic. Occupationals, again, would often be seen, the people would be seen with tools of their trade. Several examples here. A carpenter, a toolmaker, a blacksmith, and a bookkeeper. Or the scientist at work. Or the military person. again with the hand tinting. This is an interesting photograph of Phineas P. Gage, and I'm going to give you a short little radio interview about this image.
Now, this next story is also about a photograph, a much older one, actually, a daguerreotype from the mid-19th century.
We've had that daguerreotype. It's always been one of our favorites for close to 40 years.
It's one of the first daguerreotypes Jack Wilgus and his wife Beverly got their hands on when they started a collection of old photos back in the 1960s. Now, this particular photo is of a well-dressed, handsome man with a closed eye, and he's holding a metal rod. And for 40 years, Beverly and Jack Wilgus thought the man was a whaler. But then, last year, they started scanning their old photos and posting them to the online photo sharing site Flickr, and someone noticed that whaler.
It was actually a comment on the photograph.
That photo, the person wrote, is probably Phineas Gage. And who, you might ask, was Phineas Gage?
One of the most famous medical cases that you know by name.
That's Dominic Hall. He's the curator of the Warren Anatomical Museum at Harvard Medical School.
I talk about Phineas Gage every single day, in some context or another.
On September 13th, 1848, 25-year-old Phineas Gage was blasting rocks to make way for what would become the Rutland and Burlington Railroad in Vermont.
That day, while he's doing this process called tamping, which is essentially they're drilling holes in large rock, packing in some sort of explosive powder, packing sand on top of that explosive powder, laying a fuse, and then detonating the fuse.
And he was using a handmade tamping iron to pack those explosives, a 3.5-foot long iron rod, about an inch in diameter.
You get a couple of different accounts of what happens, but something clearly goes wrong, and a spark sets off the charge, and the rod is actually fired through Gage's head. It goes all the way through, comes out the top of his skull, and lands about 30 yards away.
The other workers quickly gathered around Phineas Gage as he lay on the ground.
Yeah, they certainly think he's most likely going to die. But he is actually able to, with the help of other people, make it over to an ox cart. He sits up in the ox cart and travels to a local inn where he was staying, and that's where he's attended by these physicians, but he actually never loses consciousness at this point.
He's awake the whole time.
He's awake the whole time. He's able to describe his injury.
For 3 months, a local doctor named John Harlow worked on Gage. It was a crude form of what we might now call neurosurgery. And over the next year or so, Harlow started to notice changes in Gage's personality.
Before, he gets described as businesslike, friendly, maybe efficient, responsible. He's good at managing his team on the railroad. After the accident, he's occasionally referred to as childlike, vulgar. He definitely has some social problems.
Harlow eventually brought Gage to Harvard Medical School to be studied. The students even made a plaster cast of his head, which, along with the iron rod and his actual skull, are still on display at the medical school's museum. Anyway, Gage is examined, and a paper gets published about his condition.
Then he becomes this literal textbook case. He becomes the textbook example.
The textbook example of a post-traumatic personality change. And over the next decade or so, Gage drifted. He spent some of that time as a curiosity act. He worked as a coach driver in Chile, and then he wound up in San Francisco, living with his mother. And in 1860, at the age of 36, Phineas Gage died. The result of seizures most likely related to the accident more than a decade earlier. And up until last year, no one alive really knew what Phineas Gage actually looked like because there were no known photographs or paintings of him. That is, until Beverly Wilgus emailed that scan of her daguerreotype to Dominic Hall at Harvard with a simple question.
Could this be Phineas Gage? And that started the dialogue.
They compared the scars in the image with Gage's skull, and they looked at the iron rod in the photograph and the tamping iron at Harvard's museum, both of which seemed to be engraved with the same inscription.
This is the bar that was shot through the head of Mr. Phineas P. Gage at Cavendish, Vermont, September 14th, 1848.
Dominic Hall was stunned.
sort of funny, but I have this sort of close relationship with Phineas Gage because of how often I look at his case and think about his case and talk about his case with other people. And so before, when you're only thinking of Gage, you think of a skull or you think of a life cast. But now there's this image.
And you can see that image at our website. That's npr.org.
Personally, I love how this image shows how using contemporary technology and looking at the past, we can connect with the past through photographs. Another subcategory of daguerreotypes in America was the post-mortem child photograph. By today's sensibilities, these are quite morbid and, quite frankly, sad. This was a time when child mortality rates were much higher than they are today. Sometimes the only remembrance a family might have of their young child or physical remembrance was a photograph after that child had passed. And I'm going to give you a few examples. If you want to do research on this, you'll find many examples in 19th century America. But not to be too sad or morbid, I'm just going to give you a few. Here you can see that rouge has been applied to her cheeks to make her look more lifelike. But I won't belabor this aspect of the daguerreotype. This is my pairing, but often you would see in these union cases a husband and wife shown together. Sometimes they'd be photographed together, but other times they'd be separate but placed together in the photo album, if you will, these small union cases. What you're seeing, the coloration here, is likely in the rephotographed version of this image where the silver has been oxidized. You'll usually see that around the edges of daguerreotypes, simply as some of the oxygen creeps in through the seal on the side of these cases. We also see in its infancy elements of photojournalism in these early daguerreotypes. Photojournalism, essentially the interest in recording significant human events and personalities. But again, this is also an aspect of American art at the time, of history painting, the idea of recording historic human events. In this case, it's a family posing, most likely in front of their hand-built log cabin. You see with some of the tools of their trade, you also see them there with their rifles. It tells us something about the frontier people in 19th century America. Or a traveling salesman and his buggy. And again, you can see applied color to give the image appearance of greater reality. Again, the photojournalistic aspect of recording significant human events. You can see the image of a train wreck. Or simply recording the buildings of towns and cities as they expand into the frontier. Not far from where I'm speaking in Chico, California, along the Sacramento River, you can see this early photograph, daguerreotype, whole plate of mining operations looking for gold. Daguerreotype studios started to spring up all across the country. Matthew Brady had operations in New York City and in Washington, D.C. He's someone we'll learn about even more later when we look at photographs of the Civil War. But you can see one of the photographs from his studio, again, which has probably been damaged over the years, of Andrew Jackson, or an unidentified photographer, of Sam Houston. A colleague of Louis Daguerre traveled to the United States in 1840 and delivered lectures in New York, Boston, and Providence, Rhode Island. The lecture was accompanied by a publication called The Description of the Daguerreotype Process, with a description of a provisory method for taking human portraits. In March 1840, 2 members of the spellbound audience went home and began new careers in photography: Albert Sound Southworth and Josiah Johnson Hawes. Southworth was born in Vermont in 1811. He was a teacher and later owned a drugstore in Massachusetts. After attending the lecture, he traveled to New York and through a friend met Samuel Morse, who himself had experimented with the daguerreotype. Through Morse, Southworth learned the practical rudiments of the process. In a letter to his sister, he wrote, quote, "I cannot in a letter describe all the wonders of this apparatus. Suffice to say that I can now make a picture perfect in 1 hour's time that would take a painter weeks to draw." Later that year, he established a daguerreotype studio. In 1841, he moved the business to Boston. Josiah Hawes was born in 1808. He practiced carpentry and taught himself to paint. From 1829 through 1841, he earned his way as a portrait painter. He said, quote, "The discovery of the daguerreotype took place, and some specimens of it which I saw in Boston changed my course entirely. I gave up painting and commenced daguerreotyping in 1841, end of quote. He worked in various Massachusetts towns as well as Providence, Rhode Island, making daguerreotype portraits. Detail of Southworth and Hawes meetings are not known, but the two formed a partnership in 1843. Southworth left with gold fever in 1849, returning to the Boston business in 1851 as his California venture met minimal success. In addition to his photographic work, the two made various improvements to daguerreotype equipment and later stereoscopes, which we'll learn about more in a later lecture, and sold both equipment and supplies to other photographers. Albert Southworth and Josiah Hawes produced some of the finest daguerreotypes, indeed, some of the finest portraits in any medium during the 19th century. They became the photographers of the day's celebrities. They photographed politicians, writers, business people, jurists, actors, preachers, etc. I'm going to show you some of the examples of their works. Here you can see that the daguerreotype portrait which they produced of William Henry Harrison became the piece that was used to create the official painting of the president. Again, many of the personalities of their day: Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass. Again, in photographing them, they're like photographing a mirror. You're sometimes getting reflections, which you see a little bit in this image. Susan B. Anthony, Lemuel Shaw, who was a well-known jurist at the time, politician, statesman Henry Clay. Southworth wrote about making daguerreotype portraits, quote, "What is to be done is obliged to be done quickly. The whole character of the sitter is to be read at first sight. It is required of, and should be the aim of the artist photographer, to produce in the likeness the best possible character and first expression of which that particular face or figure could ever have been capable." End of quote. Religious figure or an important business person. Again, celebrities of the day. Still at this time, reproducing photographs in print publications was not yet possible. It's something that took a few more decades before people realized how to do. So indeed, what you see in this image, the portrait that you see above, was taken from a photograph, but what they would have to do back then was to hire an artist who would etch from the photograph to create a likeness of the photograph, and the etching itself could be reproduced, in this case, wood engraving. They used the descriptive aspects of the medium as well, as you see in this photograph of the operating room in Massachusetts General Hospital. Again, the infancy, the elements of photojournalism to record important human events. But Southworth and Hawes were business people as well, and they looked for innovation, sometimes ways to create multiple portraits in one, as you see here, because ultimately their desire was to make a living with their art and their craft. They often used Renaissance-style lighting, dramatic lighting, and posing with props. But the two created some of the best examples of American daguerreotype portraits. Another photographer working in St. Louis was Thomas Easterly. Easterly was relatively unknown in the histories of photography until the 1994 publication of his work. While he was mentioned in Beaumont Newhall's Daguerreotype in America, few other references to his work existed before exhibition and publication at the Missouri Historical Society, again in 1994. However, only Southworth and Hawes left more abundant records of their daguerreotype efforts than those of Thomas Easterly. Easterly worked alone in modest St. Louis gallery, working outside the Eastern mainstream establishment. He maintained a daguerreotype practice well after the Civil War, an anomaly as the other processes now outstripped it in popularity, and was the only one in the area to do so. He considered himself, quote, the last of the old-style picturemen. He produced some amazing portraits. Again, you see it in the sort of gilded frames and the union case. He was interested in different ethnicities as well, photographing Anglo-Americans, African-Americans, and a number of American Indians. You see, some of his greatest works are that of Native Americans, again, posing for their portrait, They would usually be clamped into place to hold them still, but these beautiful photographs added to them color, which you see, and to really give them a greater sense of realism. Kind of ironic that adding paint to a photograph made it more realistic rather than less. But these are also not only the idea of portraiture, which was common in America, but in that idea of a historical witness. We saw that in history painting. We see that in daguerreotypes as well. And indeed, the idea of the historical witness is something that pervades photography even to this day. Again, these pairings are mine, not Easterly's. Saw a wonderful exhibit of these, as I mentioned before, at the Missouri Historical Society. Quite memorable. Like many other photographers, photographed the landmark of Niagara Falls somewhere around 1853. It was an emerging national symbol. We'll talk more about landscape photography in a later lecture. Another daguerreotype practitioner was Boston-based John Adams Whipple. He was an American inventor, early photographer. As a boy, he was introduced to chemistry. He pioneered astronomical and night photography. He made extraordinary early photographs of the moon, as you see here, and he produced some of the first images of stars other than the sun. He also photographed some of Boston's personalities. You see here, portrait of Daniel Webster. Whipple's health impaired his work, though he devoted himself to photography. He made his first daguerreotype in the winter of 1840, quote, using a sunglass for a lens, a candle box for a camera, and the handle of a silver spoon as a substitute for a plate. Over time, he became a prominent daguerreotype portraitist in Boston, in addition to making portraits for the Whipple and Black studio. He photographed important buildings in and around Boston. Things to remember from this lecture. The daguerreotype, announced in 1839. It's a highly detailed mirror image. It's one of a kind and not easily reproducible. Popular in America from around 1840 to the mid-1850s. It was widely used for portraits, and while daguerreotypes were made of all sorts of subjects, it was predominantly used for portraits in this country. It came in standard sizes, the 6 plate being the most popular. You can read the size there. And even the whole plate is relatively small by photographs of today's standards, 6.5 by 8.5 inches.